Because Vivek is going to talk about the political economy of reforms and about, this whole issue of people giving up control, how much regulation, and all of that. So Vivek, over to you.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? It just kicked in. Thank you, Sita, and thank you to the Atlas Network and CCS. Now, I'm going to be a little old-fashioned and stand at a lectern. These are fast disappearing, so please hang on to this one. So, I think to this audience, I don't have to convince you that we want to deregulate, we want to pursue liberal economic policies and move towards smaller government and so on. Now, that wouldn't be the case in a different audience. I was speaking at a college event yesterday at one of the well-known colleges in Mumbai, where the default position was that markets are evil and globalization is some capitalist conspiracy to take over the world. But clearly in this audience, I won't have to convince you that we want to move towards better, more sensible economic policies. So then the interesting question for me is, well, why don't we observe those policies? Political economy, or public choice as they call it in Virginia circles. So if economic reform is indeed good economics, and I think we take it as read in this room that it is, shouldn't it also be good politics? By definition, good economic policy should be Pareto improving in technical terminology, or to put it sort of roughly, most people should benefit, right? And if citizens understand these benefits, surely they should support these policies. But yet we see throughout the world, not just in emerging economies, but throughout the advanced economies, that economic reforms are politically difficult or politically contentious. Right? So now, as it happens, there's a large body of academic literature and research, which I'm not going to go into in any great detail, but I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if there's interest, to try to help us make sense of this puzzle. And as I read this literature, I myself have contributed to it, so has Alex, of other friends in this room. The crucial insight is that even good economic policy reforms that are good for the economy or good for everyone in the aggregate, so again, Pareto improving in technical language, bring distributional impacts that will harm some while they benefit others, in the absence of some mechanism to ensure that everyone is better off and none are worse off. The potential losers, therefore, have an incentive to block a reform that is good for the economy as a whole. This problem becomes important if they're also politically powerful and so can veto a reform in some way, unless they're somehow cajoled, bribed, whatever word you want to use, into accepting it. Now, I want to stress again, and for this audience, hopefully this won't come as an especially provocative idea, this persuading the losers to come on board need not be done by the government. It could be. But in a world of low transactions costs, and if we invoke the Coase theorem, then there's a way that private actors working on their own could ensure that if in fact this aggregate gain, that a minority of those who lose can be compensated and still come out ahead. But again, I don't want to get too technical. But the crux of the idea is distributional conflict. This is sort of the first law of political economy. Distributional conflict is why we don't see good economic reforms that are efficiency enhancing in the aggregate. Why don't they just sail through? Because there are winners and there are losers, and the losers have an incentive to try and block these good reforms. So intergroup distributional conflict, in other words, is filtered through political institutions, is central to explaining why good economic reforms often prove politically difficult. Now, let me connect this to India. You began with talking about the reforms agenda in India. So the reality is that politicians want to get elected, they want to get re-elected. This is not a controversial, or shouldn't be a controversial idea, but it has extremely important political economy implications. Okay? And again, there is a very large, or at least a burgeoning academic and policy literature to speak to what should be a very basic question. In other words, are the interests of politicians aligned to those of society as a whole, the economy as a whole, aggregate economic welfare, whatever term you want to use. And crucial to understanding that then is probing this question, is it the case that politicians, let's say incumbent politicians, are rewarded for good economic stewardship? Is it true that if the incumbent politician, the politician in power, delivers good economic performance, let's say as measured by economic growth, to put it in a simple way, is he or she rewarded electorally by that? And therefore, this creates an incentive for the politician to pursue good economic policy, right? Now, this seems to be the received assumption in many advanced economies, and there's a fair amount of some academic literature which supports this notion, although it's not, there is some contestation in this literature as well. But I think it's fair to say that the kind of general perception exists, whether it's true or not, that good economic policy is rewarded in some way by voters, and this creates an incentive to pursue good economic policy. I think the US is the closest thing that we have to evidence for this proposition. But in the case of India, for instance, we don't have, we have some evidence that it's suggestive that perhaps in some cases, maybe in some state elections, that incumbents are rewarded for good economic stewardship, but the evidence is scant. And if you look at the evidence, I think, with an open mind, you probably will think that that elections in India, whether elections at the central government level to the Lok Sabha, state governments, there's a fair element of randomness in it. It's still a black box. We don't fully understand why voters vote the way they do. We don't fully understand whether economics motivates them. And this comes out very sharply. So if you look at what the research shows, and I'm drawing on some work by a colleague of mine at IDFC Institute, which suggests that when you look, for example, at state elections to state government, in a particular data set, which I can talk about later if there's interest, incumbents were re-elected 15 times and defeated 23 times. There was no statistically significant difference between state growth rates in the cases of successful as against defeated incumbents. In fact, the relationship between growth and re-election appears to be random. And if this is the case, then it's a rather dispiriting proposition, because it suggests that if incumbent politicians, if those in government believe that re-election prospects are a crapshoot, or some totally random event, or don't necessarily depend on economic performance, then obviously it weakens their incentive to deliver good economic management, right? And it relies on some other sense, perhaps basic altruistic notion that, look, if it depends on nothing, if it's random, let me just do the best I can to pursue good economic policies. So I could go on this in this vein, but let me just leave it by saying that we all agree, I think most of us in this room would agree what we ought to do. So there's no debate on the normative. But the old reflex of saying, if politicians don't do what we the economists, we the advisors think they should do, somehow are stupid or irrational, is absolutely wrong. The politicians have a very good reason for doing what they're doing. Their incentives may not be aligned with ours or with that of the economy as a whole. And so we've got to really probe this and try to change the institutional structures or realign the incentives. And so, for example, the work that you're doing, Free a Billion, get the word out on the cost of bad economic policy. Get voters to pay attention to the fact that, look, I should care about this. So again, I'll leave it there for now, but I think we've got to be focused very much on how do we change the incentives of politicians to get them, to induce them to do what's good, not just for themselves electorally, but also good for the economy as a whole. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivek. I think that sort of summed up things very